Well, good morning, Kingswood. We are in the midst of our Lenten series as we explore these 24 hours of Jesus' life before his death, which we'll look at on Good Friday and then celebrate his resurrection on Easter. But let us not move too hastily to Easter, yes? How many of you heard that Reverend Dr. Billy Graham died last week? Let's see a show of hands there. All right. Now, how many of you knew who Reverend Dr. Billy Graham was? Okay, a fair amount, yes. For those of you who don't know who Reverend Graham was, Reverend Graham died at the age of 99 years old last week. For over 60 years, he traveled the globe proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. Some would have called him the Mother Teresa of Protestant evangelicalism. He was very, very well known, at least by name. He filled stadiums around the world, including Madison Square Garden with 2 million people. He was an advisor and a comforter to over half a dozen presidents, as well as a consultor to many world leaders during his time. His impact on evangelicalism and Christianity in general was probably unlike anyone else in modern times. Yet, this man who we view as this sort of icon of the faith, he was not always perfect. He told The Exchange recently, as he was nearing the end of his life, in an article they wrote on him, that he wished he had done more to take down the ropes of racism that divided our country. Looking back at his life, he wished that he had stood up more and spoken to those issues. Now, Dr. Graham did do a fair amount for the work of racism and the end of segregation in our country. Some of you may have heard or have known the stories of Dr. Graham filling stadiums here in the United States, and he would direct the ushers to take down the ropes that divided the areas where blacks and white folk would sit. And the ushers declined. And so Dr. Graham himself, many times in the stadiums he would fill, he would take down the ropes himself. Also, when Martin Luther King was arrested and for his work in Birmingham, Dr. Graham paid for his bail to get him out of jail. Yet, as Dr. Martin Luther King discusses sort of his relationship with Dr. Graham, it's very interesting to kind of hear the dialogue that occurs. Dr. Martin Luther King says he appreciates the work that Dr. Graham did, but also says he wished that he had done more, just as Dr. Graham admits himself later in his life. He says that he wished that he had accepted the invitation to come to the March on Washington. Dr. Graham was invited to stand on the stage where Dr. Martin Luther King made the speech, "I Had a Dream," and to march to the streets with him. But Dr. Graham declined, and he said he believed that his work and his time was better spent doing the work of evangelism. Then when Dr. Martin Luther King was imprisoned, he penned a letter, and he talked about how he wished that Dr. Graham and other white preachers had been more vocal about the importance of desegregation in our country and challenging and calling them to speak out and to stand up for this social issue. But Dr. Graham said that he felt that he wanted to avoid social issues because he felt that by talking about them, it would kind of deter his base, and the people who would listen to him might not have listened to him, and he wouldn't be able to share the gospel with as many people possible. And he believed his goal was to share the gospel with as many people as he could. Yet, despite these statements that Dr. Graham made early in his life, as he looked back, he couldn't help but say to himself, "I wish I had done more to remove the ropes of racism in our country." But what stopped him? What prevented him? You know what I think it was? It's a thing that is in all of us. Fear. No matter how faithful we are, no matter how much faith we have, even the icon of the modern day faith, Billy Graham, fear often cripples us from stepping out in faith, from living into our faith. Fear of what will people say, what will people think, how will this affect my mission, how will this affect what I feel called to do primarily, how will this affect their perception and my relationship with certain people. Fear often grips us and stops us in our tracks. And it reminds me of the same fear that I see in our text today here in Mark chapter 14. In Mark chapter 14, we pick up where Pastor James led us last week, which was the arrest of Jesus in the garden in the dark of the night so that no one would see what was going on. And they bring him then, where we are in our text today, before the 70 Sanhedrin priests and the high priest and the legal consultants to begin their case against Jesus. Now, what's fascinating to me is that they are dead set on not just beating him or imprisoning him, but killing him. Please know that Jesus was not the first guy who claimed to be the Messiah. There were plenty before him. And it's fascinating that in this instance, though, they want him to go to death. And even as the scriptures tell us, as false witnesses come before to also offer what seem to be contradictory witnesses, or I should say accounts of Jesus in the text, it tells us that still they persisted, they wanted to kill Jesus. Still they persisted that he deserved to be crucified. Why? Why were they so insistent? Well, I think the best way to understand that is to look at the text of the day and understand the cultural context of the time. So the Romans were in complete power and control, yet there were other people groups that were allowed to live in the land, allowed to live in the space, whether that was because they were there when they were conquered and they surrendered, or because of exiled people, or because, hey, more people, more taxes, that sounds great, we welcome you. But not everybody was Roman citizens. Not everyone had the same privileges and the same rights. You could live in Rome, but that didn't mean you were a Roman citizen. If you weren't a Roman citizen, then you didn't have the same rights as everyone else who lived there. And many of the Jews did not have Roman citizenship. And I can't help but think about the similarities between our country, between folks who were black and white, and folks who were Roman and Jew in this context, and the divisions that existed and the rights and privileges that were allowed to some but not to all. And in this text, what's really frustrating for the Jews and fearful for the Jews is this reality. They realize that Jesus is really shaking up the status quo. For them, they know that they can live in peace in Rome as long as they pay to Caesar what is Caesar's, and as long as they submit to the authority that is, and they know their place, and they stay in place. But Jesus comes, and he's really shaking up the system. He's poking at it. He's stepping out of place. But Jesus isn't just stepping out of place like the Messiahs who before him had come. He's actually gaining a following. His teaching's gaining some traction. It's making some people uncomfortable. And so the Jewish leaders of that day are going, this is not good. If the Roman Empire catches wind of the reality that Jesus is not just claiming to be the Messiah, who they believe to be would be the king of the Jews, the Romans will not just squash those few Jews who are rising up, they'll squash all of us. They won't make a distinguish between, oh, those are the Jews that are sort of rising up and causing problems, and these are the ones who are being respectful and staying in their place. No. They'll just end all of us. And it instills fear in the minds of the religious leaders of the day. You see, they believed that whoever the Messiah was would be their king. They believed that whoever the Messiah was would rule and reign for them, that would overthrow the Roman government and bring them some sort of freedom, and they were waiting for that liberation. But when Jesus comes, he is not at all how they had pictured him. He was not at all how their ancestors had told him and interpreted the scriptures of how the Messiah would be. Jesus comes and he says to lay down the sword. Jesus comes and he says to turn the other cheek. Jesus comes and he begins to question their interpretations of Scripture and begins to help them understand the heart of the law when they were so stuck on the letter of the law. And this instills fear in the religious leaders. And so here they are in the temple courts saying we've got to quiet him, we've got to end him, because if we don't, we'll all be ended by the powers that be in Rome. We've got ourselves a Martin Luther King rising up. We've got a liberator rising up. We've got a resistor rising up. We've got someone who isn't just knowing their place, and they're going to cost it for all of us. And so fear rises in them. And fear then stunts them from really being able to see and hear Jesus' message. You know, when I think about that same fear, that fear that Dr. Billy Graham experienced that held him back, that same fear that drove the religious leaders of the day to condemn Jesus, I think about that same fear in my own life. Each generation has their thing, don't they? Their World War I, their World War II, their Vietnam. For my generation, it was 9/11. I'll never forget the day. I'll never forget where I was at. I'll never forget the images. Ingrained in my mind, 9/11. Now, as a kid, I was trying to make sense of what happened on 9/11. And as I got older, the images and the people and the conversations and the news stations that I channeled into deeply ingrained in me that all Muslims should be feared. That all Muslims were evil and radicalized, and there was something about their book that made them dangerous, and so we could not trust them, and I should be fearful of them. And I'll admit to you, most of my life, very afraid of Muslims. I can even remember when I was at Moody Bible Institute, spending one day at a conference they had based on helping us see the need to quench Islam in our country because they were concerned that in Europe, when churches were closing, Islam was moving in and taking over the buildings, and that America was their next goal, and that they wanted to have rule and reign and most power in Islam. And I remember sitting going, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming, and what is this? And I can't believe this. And I remember fear hitting in me, and me thinking that that's the enemy, and I need to deal with this somehow. But here's the crazy part about this. Just a few years ago was the first time I ever met a Muslim. Everything I thought about Muslims was based on what everyone else had told me. It was based on those images I saw across the screen on 9/11 and the news reports that came out after. I had never actually even physically met a Muslim. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, one of those being I was deeply afraid of them. So why would I try to meet someone I was afraid of? What would they do to me? How would they treat me? What would they say about me? Maybe they would say something and convince me and bring me onto their side. I mean, all these unrealistic fears in my mind. I remember meeting a Muslim for the first time just a few years ago and going, hold on, wait, what? You don't fit my worldview and my understanding and what I've been told and what I was taught. I just don't understand how to process this. But as I talked to them and got to know them more, because I began to meet more Muslims after that, I began to have fear in my heart tore down. And I began to have a more holistic view. I began to realize that not all Muslims were bad. Most Muslims were not bad. And I began to realize that just in every group, there always is people. Even in our Christian faith. We just saw just this last year, and I'll name it as KKK marching through the streets. This is a group that claims to have Christian beliefs that has taken our same Bible that I'm preaching from and holding right here and used it for hate. We could talk about Hitler and the Nazi regime that also used the Bible to put into people's minds an anti-Semitic message. A Christian-based idea from scriptures that have been misinterpreted and misunderstood. Reality is, we all have our history and our story. Reality is we can either use our faith, or this book right here, I should say, for faith and for goodness, or for fear and for anger and for revenge. Because at the end of the day, we get to interpret this book for ourselves, filled with the Spirit of God. And oftentimes, like Dr. Graham or like the religious leaders of the day, or like myself, we can be filled with more fear than we can be filled with faith. Oftentimes, we can allow our fear to lead us instead of our faith, and it can only create more damage. At the end of our text today, I find myself coming back to Peter. Peter here witnesses this whole trial of injustice against Jesus, that they've decided to condemn him, even though, quite frankly, the facts and the witnesses don't all add up, and they don't have a strong case. They decide still to beat him and condemn him. And Peter then, as the movie scene shoots to him standing alongside a fire, they say, that guy right there, that guy, he followed Jesus. I've seen him. And immediately, Peter's like, no, not me. This is the guy that just a few hours ago literally said to Jesus, oh Lord, if you go to the cross and die, I'll follow you. Wherever you go, I'll never leave you, and I'll always be by your side. This is a guy who just a few hours ago was filled with so much overwhelming faith. He was even willing to die for Jesus, but now in this moment, he's overwhelmed with fear. Crippling fear that leads him to even deny who Jesus is. Deny that he ever even knew Jesus. You see, the beautiful thing, I think, about being a Christian and about following Jesus is that that's not the end of the story. It's that Jesus still comes to Peter later and says, Peter, upon you I will build my church. This guy who walked on water, but then the next minute denies that he even knew Jesus, and runs away with his tail between his legs to hide in an upper room. Jesus then extends forgiveness and says, "Oh, Peter, you're human. I told you would do that. I told you because often we are so prone to be filled with fear instead of faith." But God is a God who still uses the Billy Grahams of the world despite their moments of fear. God is a God who still uses 70 Sanhedrin priests who vote to end the life of Jesus. And God still uses that for his glory. God still uses this preacher who had prejudice and hatred and fear against Muslims because of my own experiences. And he comes and says, we can work with that. We can heal that. We can restore that. Just like God worked through Peter and said, even though you had your moments of fear, I can still work with that. I can still heal that. I can still restore it. So as we bring an end to the message, I'm going to challenge us to do a few things. I want to ask you, where is it that you see injustice in your world? And how might God be inviting you to engage that injustice? And how may fear be stopping you? Also, I encourage you to maybe look inside yourself and ask yourself, as I did, what prejudices do I have? What people groups do I try to avoid, or maybe I've never even talked to? And I'm going to invite you, maybe you engage in a conversation with someone, and you begin the work of tearing down those prejudices and not allowing fear to prevent those conversations, but allowing faith to give you the ability to step out and have them. The last area is, where have you failed in the past to maybe have stepped up? Where would you, like Billy Graham, maybe have looked back in your life and gone, I just wish I had done more here. I missed the mark before, but I've still got breath in my lungs, and I've still got energy in my step, and I can still do something. And so I challenge us all here today to resist the fear that divides us, to embrace the faith that unites us, to resist the fear that condemns the other, and to embrace the faith that embraces the other. To resist the fear that appeals to the masses, and to embrace the faith that cares for the least. For it's only when we do that that we can truly be a people who live not in fear, but in faith. As we leave this space and this place and go out into the world, we ask that God would give us not a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. Today, we relinquish fears to you, God. We renounce insecurity and anxiety, and we receive a calm and stable spirit, that we may be a people that live not by fear, but by faith.
Amen.